All right, welcome everybody. My name is Kristi Govella and I'm the director of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs here at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. So on behalf of the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs, as well as our co-sponsors, the Center for Chinese Studies and the Center for Pacific Island Studies, we're so happy that you could join us today, both our in-person audience and folks joining us online. We're really excited to be hosting a session today on China's engagement in the Pacific Islands. It's been a topic that's been in the news pretty much constantly, especially since some big developments last year. So we want to look at how China's engagement with the Pacific Islands has been evolving and how the Pacific Islands are engaging with China on their own terms. And we're so lucky to have with us today two fabulous experts who can really shed light on both sides of those equations for us. We have Dr. April Herlevi, who is Senior Research Scientist in Indo-Pacific Security Affairs at CNA. She's an expert on Chinese foreign and security policy, economic statecraft for technology acquisition, and the increasing role of Chinese commercial, economic, and military actors globally. She recently edited a report for the National Bureau of Asian Research called Charting a New Course for the Pacific Islands, Strategic Pathways for U.S. Micronesia Engagement. And she's also published a host of other research on port operations along China's Maritime Silk Road, Chinese views of Oceania, and China-Middle East relations. Prior to joining CNA, April served in the federal government and held positions with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Agency for International Development. We also have with us Dr. Tarcisius Kabutaulaka, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Pacific Island Studies here at the University of Hawaii at Mānoa. He's a political scientist and has published extensively on the Solomon Islands civil unrest and the Australia-led regional intervention, the forestry industry in the Solomon Islands, China and Oceania, and governance issues in the Pacific. He joined us here in the Center for Pacific Island Studies in 2009 and was director for 3 years. And prior to that, he was also at the East-West Center Pacific Islands Development Program and at the University of the South Pacific. He's also done consultancy work for governments, regional and international organizations, and NGOs in the Pacific Islands. So really, we couldn't have two better people here to talk with us about these topics. We're going to start out by with April telling us a little bit about what China's been up to in the region, and then we'll hear from Tara on what has been going on from the Pacific Islands perspective, and then we'll open it up to questions after that. So April, please take it away.
Great. Aloha and mahalo to Kristi and the Center for Indo-Pacific Affairs for inviting me to speak with you today. And I also have to thank my co-panelists. I've read a lot of your work over the years, and that has helped me understand the Pacific much better. So thanks to the students here at UH Manoa and the online audience. To set the stage from the outset, I am a political economist and have spent my career studying China. My original research was really China's domestic political economy, but as they started to move out in the world, there were more and more questions about what they were doing abroad. So my research agenda has really shifted to that foreign economic policy aspect. As I sort of said, I am not a Pacific Islander nor an indigenous scholar, but I have learned a tremendous amount about this region from both those important research communities. And I'm grateful every day to actually be living here in Hawaii and learning more about the culture. I've been at the Center for Naval Analysis since 2017, and I'm obligated to note here that the views I'm expressing are my own and do not represent CNA. For today's talk, I've combined the findings from 3 different research projects I've been working on over the past several years. And I'm just going to cover the wave top. So if there's any specific topics people want to hear more about, I'm happy to do that in the Q&A. I always emphasize kind of 3 main themes when I talk about this topic. Is first, do the research and dig into the details. There's a lot of complexity here, and I think that's a really important point to emphasize. Second, I always tell people to make sense of China-Pacific Island relations, you need to understand the strategies and the narratives of each side. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the talk. And since Kristi did mention the report we did on Micronesia for the National Bureau of Asian Research, in that report we talk about how the U.S. needs to think about long-term engagement if the Pacific Partnership strategy is going to actually be successful. So I don't go into that in my prepared remarks, but happy to talk about it later. In terms of the research, I bring this up because I think to understand China's activities in any region, you really need to dig into the specific details of that individual country. I say that because I've done a lot of work on China's domestic political economy, where even from province to province, you see different changes. There is actually a lot more variation domestically than I think people realize. So it depends on who's doing the work abroad to really understand what's going on. I also emphasize that point when I talk to people because host nations have agency. China may have an agenda and something it wants to accomplish, but I've actually been I think one of the most fascinating things about studying the Pacific Islands is I think you've got countries that have actually been quite savvy as negotiators in terms of using that relationship to get the leverage they want. So I think you really do need to look at both sides. And I try to avoid the sweeping generalizations about China. There are some general patterns that I'll talk about in a moment, but there's sometimes in the media this sense of inevitability that China goes forth, carries out its policy, and it's just a fait accompli. And I just think that's inaccurate. So I always try to correct that perception when I give talks. The second point is why I bring up strategic, like narratives. We all know the US, China, the Pacific Islands, they each have their own narrative about what they're trying to accomplish. And I think you really do need to understand all of those and how they interact with each other to understand what's successful, what's working, and what's not. So I'll first kind of go into I'm going to touch on a little bit of background about how I even got involved in this research, and then I'm going to dive into some of China's narratives. For me, this research agenda grew out of a sense of frustration. So in 2010, I was still in the federal government, and I was asked a lot of questions about what is China doing in the Pacific. At the time, it was mostly actually around the Chinese satellite tracking station in Kiribati, which was closed after they switched recognition to Taiwan. The other issue is PLA Navy ships and other vessels would occasionally transit the region, so that question would come up. But what I found when I was asked these questions is, one, there was little understanding of Chinese foreign policy, and there was even less understanding of what Pacific Island countries' perspectives was. So as a research scholar, I felt like it was my job to get smart on the Pacific. That's why I actually thank the University of Hawaii for all the great books they've published. That's how I did that. And I'll be honest, my early research was almost exclusively on Micronesia, because most of the questions at the time were about that. Obviously, the US has a historic relationship with several countries in Micronesia. And so that's where the focus was. And it was only more recently that I've really started looking more in depth on Melanesia, because obviously China's presence is somewhat more profound and larger in Melanesia, in part just because the countries and the economies are somewhat larger. So what is China trying to accomplish? I'm sure everyone in this room and on the online audience has heard a lot about the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road. That is the foundation, but I also like to highlight that while that now appears as a grand strategy and it seems all together, over time that has come together. When it first began, it was pretty haphazard and it was unclear what that was going to accomplish. I spend a lot of time now, because I look at technology, looking at the digital Silk Road, and I bring that up because in countries like the Solomon Islands, that's really what the crux of the relationship is. It's about internal security, telecommunications. But in the broad, sweeping sort of Chinese foreign policy specific to the Pacific Islands, there are still three main goals. The first is to expand China's economic and diplomatic presence. They've done that. That has been throughout the world, but it has happened a lot in the Pacific Islands, although still not as much as I would say the Middle East, some parts of Africa, and the Indian Ocean. The second main goal is to isolate Taiwan diplomatically. There are still 4 countries in the Pacific Islands that recognize Taiwan, and until no countries in the world recognize Taiwan, that will never end for the People's Republic of China. They will continue to pursue that goal. The third goal is expanding the ability of the People's Liberation to operate in what they term their far seas. I've written a whole chapter on that if you're interested, in terms of how the PLA is thinking about moving from what they call their near seas to their far seas. All of these goals are sort of encapsulated in what China calls the China-Oceania South Pacific Blue Economic Corridor. And that is sort of a general name. There's not a lot of specifics from that, and we can talk more about that in Q&A. Most recently, as I said, I've been looking a lot more at Melanesia, and that's primarily because that's where a lot of the activity has been. So I tend to compare China's relationship with Fiji to the Solomon Islands, and I do so because there's just some key differences that I think are important to note. I always start, so after the 2006 military coup in Fiji, it was really Fiji that it was part of their look north policy to work on bettering its relationship with China. Now, it was not completely one-sided. China was interested in this, but I like to point that out because at that time, this was really avoiding diplomatic isolation. I've got a few quotes here from the former ambassador and high commissioner to the Pacific, which they say, Fiji's post-2006 diplomatic isolation by traditional allies was the needed impetus for it to explore and maximize new opportunities. So this was about getting other partners, which is unsurprising for any country that feels diplomatically isolated. At the time, China said, okay, well, this is interesting. We have some opportunities. In terms of military interactions, there was cooperation on UN peacekeeping. For China's part, they continue to be the largest UN Security Council member that contributes to peacekeeping missions. So that was a natural fit because Fiji has long been involved in peacekeeping. In 2018, Fiji was seeking external funds to renovate the Black Rock camp in Nadi, which is a regional hub for peacekeeping. And according to Australian media, the PRC had offered to assist with those renovations, and that was a concern to Australia. So in the end, Australia made a counteroffer and ended up undertaking the renovation. Now, the media reporting at that time was pretty sparse, but it appears that Fiji was able to quite effectively leverage this. What we didn't call it strategic competition at the time, but that's what they did. They were able to get a better deal for what they wanted. And I think that we see that sort of behavior. Second, Fiji had become a regular port call. PLA Navy vessels went there. The harmonious mission deployments, which is what they call when they send their hospital ship, what's called the Peace Arc to the region. They do that. They've made several visits to Fiji and other countries. That's going on most recently in anticipation of the Pacific Games. So that kind of work continues. So that was a long-standing, so basically over 10 to 15 years, the China-Fiji relationship developed. Now, some recent things have sort of changed in Fiji, but I like to contrast that with the Solomon Islands because in some ways, I think one of the reasons it's in 2019, the Solomon Islands changed their diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to the PRC. And then by April 2022, the PRC and Solomon Islands had agreed to a 5-year security agreement that, quote, allows the government to request China to send police, armed police, military personnel, and other law enforcement to the Solomon Islands to assist in, quote, maintaining social order, end quote. After the 2023 official state visit by Prime Minister Sogavare, both sides recommitted to strengthening Solomon Islands police law enforcement capacity. So in this way, it was really about the law enforcement. And this is why I brought up the internal security. In China itself, internal security takes up a much larger portion of the budget than actually the PLA, because it's a major concern. And they've done a lot in terms of putting in place the telecommunication systems to sort of monitor internal security issues. So in my opinion, this has been one of the reasons the Solomon Islands has been so interested in engagement, is because they could take advantage of some of these technologies. My colleague from CNA, Christopher Carnes, and I have written a short article about PRC Solomon Islands where we talk about at least 3 different reasons for this growing relationship. First is at the personal level. There's been a lot of talk about Prime Minister Sogavare, and there's been criticism of his close ties to China, but a lot of that has been allegations about this so-called slush fund of money that China gives and that he's allowed to spend as he sees fit. It's very hard to get hard data on that stuff. I'll leave that to my colleague if he has some thoughts on that topic. But the second reason is really this internal security dynamic, I think, can be exacerbated by the external tension. So when China and Taiwan continued to, what they called in the 1990s, do dollar diplomacy, that sometimes exacerbates those internal tensions because each side might have a preference and try to get funds. So I think that sort of dynamic is still continuing. In terms of the commercial presence of Chinese actors, they've primarily provided infrastructure related to telecommunications. So in August 2022, Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant, agreed to build 161 data towers in the Solomon Islands, with the plan for 48 of those to be completed before the Pacific Games. The China Import-Export Bank is actually funding that loan project. And prior to this announcement, Huawei had provided equipment to the telecommunications industry, but had not built infrastructure. China is also building some of the infrastructure for the Pacific Games. That's gotten a lot of interest, but they've also promised official development assistance through the BRI to support the Solomon Islands 2035 development strategy. So at present, the relationship is really centered on trade, proposed infrastructure and policing support. But as I mentioned, some of these controversies are really about what they call the constituency development funds. Supposedly, China has given money that has gone to those funds, and some people view that as corruption. I haven't dug into that issue sufficiently to say, but most of the data I'm pulling is from the Lowy Institute's Pacific Aid Map. So if you're interested in that topic, they're a great resource for looking at those official aid. To shift gears just for a moment before I wrap up, I'd like to often talk about the reaction. So the other research project I've been a part of is we did a Track 1.5 dialogue in Melanesia earlier this spring. And what was reiterated repeatedly in that event was, first and foremost, Melanesian countries face significant development challenges because incomplete nation building is a serious security concern. And so what we were told repeatedly is dialogue participants view China as an important development partner, and they want to maintain that strategic autonomy. I think it's also important to note that one of the issues that has come up both in that dialogue and other venues is that US-China competition, while it can be helpful for getting a better bargain for certain countries, so there is concern that it could be damaging Pacific unity and solidarity. We will have a report about that dialogue coming out this winter, so I will leave that there. And then to conclude my remarks, I really did just want to talk a bit about the difference in terms of how this engagement occurs. In the past, China's engagement was really bilateral, but we see that shifting. That's a pattern that we've seen elsewhere in the world. They used to, in ASEAN, really just go bilateral to each country. They've done a lot more work engaging with ASEAN as an organization. We're starting to see that now in the Pacific. They still primarily do bilateral engagement, but they are making strides to engage with the Pacific Islands Forum. So that's a shift. But at the crux of each of these, I think, is the divergent goals that each of these groupings want. So the Pacific Islands still want action on climate change. China's approach to its foreign policy is led by its economic activity, although information and other forms of diplomacy do bolster that engagement. And then US policy is still primarily led by, what's termed hard security, but really the money's with the military, which is an odd fit for a region that only has 3 standing militaries. So you've got, when I hear people say great power competition or strategic competition, I think it's important to remember you've got 3 different or more things going on in this region, creating all sorts of new issues. And with that, I'm going to conclude and turn it over to my co-panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you, April. First, thank you, Kristi, for inviting me, and it's an honor to be here. I'm going to make a few very general remarks, and perhaps we can get into a lot more detailed discussions during Q&A. And the first one is that China is both new as well as old in the Pacific. And it depends on what aspect of China you're looking at. If you're looking at Chinese people and Chinese culture, they have been in the Pacific for a long time. Chinese people in a lot of Pacific Island places in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. And therefore that place, it plays into the kind of geopolitical discussions that are taking place. Because a lot of Pacific Islanders, particularly in places like Samoa, have Chinese heritage. And therefore it is important to take that into consideration. However, a lot of times when we talk about China, I think the focus is on the state. And if we look at the Chinese state, yes, it's relatively new, but not so new in its engagement with the Pacific. The People's Republic of China established diplomatic relations with a couple of Pacific Island countries in the 1970s. And remember, the UN decision to shift to recognizing the PRC happened in 1971. In 1975, Fiji and Samoa established diplomatic relations with China. And then Papua New Guinea in 1976, Vanuatu in 1982, and so forth, and the rest of the Pacific Islands much later. Of course, Kiribati and the Solomon Islands are the latest in 2019. So that's my first point, that China is both new as well as old in the Pacific. And therefore, people's interactions and engagement with China is often influenced by that, by both the new China and the old China as well. The second point is that China is not monolithic. that when we are talking about China, it is important to be very clear about what kind of China we're dealing with, whether it's the Chinese state, whether it's Chinese citizens, or whether it's Chinese companies. So there are different manifestations of China that have different impacts in the Pacific Islands region, and that's important to take note of. And the third point is that China is also very dynamic as well in the region. That over time, and particularly from the mid-2000s up until now, what we've seen is that China changing, and different parts of China also reformulating themselves in light of the discussions that are taking place. The Chinese state's doing that, Chinese companies, and also Chinese people as well. Both Chinese people who are citizens of Pacific Island places, as well as the new ones who are coming in. In terms of relationship, as April mentioned, initially China's engagement with the Pacific was largely bilateral. So it was with individual countries. What we've seen in recent years, particularly from the last 10 years, is that there is a greater attempt, at least, to engage multilaterally. And examples of that include the China-Pacific Islands Foreign Ministers meeting, for instance, which they have regularly. And then, of course, in 2022, last year, the attempt to sign a security and trade agreement with the Pacific Islands through the Pacific Islands Forum. That, of course, failed. But it is unlikely that the PRC will give up on that idea. And I think what we will see is greater multilateral engagement. And it would be interesting to see what happens in the Cook Islands at the meeting that is taking place at the moment. The other thing is Chinese assistance. And yes, Chinese assistance has increased over the years, but as we all know, Chinese assistance is nowhere close to Australian assistance to Pacific Islands. That Australia is still the largest donor to Pacific Island countries. What we've seen with Chinese assistance in recent years is that there is a decline in Chinese assistance. And that's partly to do with Chinese economy, as well as Pacific Island governments also in their engagement with China. Fiji, for instance, has not taken a loan from China for a while, for a couple of years. And a lot of Chinese assistance is through concessional loans. Grants a small percentage of Chinese assistance. That includes the stadium that you're talking about in the Solomons, although people are debating whether it's a grant or it's a concessional loan. But the official word is that it is a grant. If it is a grant, it is one of the biggest grants that China's given to a Pacific Island country, apart from grants that they've given to places like Papua New Guinea. And so we've seen a decline, and the Lowy Institute, which April mentioned, put out a report showing the decline in Chinese assistance to Pacific Islands. But they also made it very clear that it does not mean that there will be a disappearance of Chinese engagements and aid with Pacific Island countries, that they will continue to engage even if there is a decline. Now, I want to focus on something that I think is very important and sometimes ignored in the discussions about China, and that's Chinese companies. And Chinese companies, I think, are vital to understanding Chinese diplomacy in the Pacific Islands for a number of reasons. One is that they are often the ones on the ground, and they are often the ones who have connections to political leads as well as officials within countries. They are the ones with on-the-ground knowledge of Pacific Island places. They are the ones who have connections. And therefore their role, either directly or indirectly in supporting the Chinese state, is very, very important. In the case of Solomon Islands, for instance, long before China established diplomatic relations with the Solomons, Chinese companies like Czech, for instance, the China Harbor Engineering Corporation was there. Most of it was contracted, was funded not by the Chinese government, but by the Solomon Islands government as well as ADB. The other thing is their ability to compete for contracts in the Pacific Islands is also increasing. And a lot of people think that because it is a Chinese company, therefore it is Chinese funded. A lot of these contracts are actually funded by World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and in some cases by the national governments of those Pacific Island places. When the delegation from the Chinese embassy in Port Moresby went to Honiara before the switch, a huge percentage of that delegation were actually Chinese company officials. And so they were the ones who knew the connections within the country. The other thing is not so much the Chinese SOEs or companies. So Chinese companies are complicated. So you have the SOEs, you have the CCECC or China Railway or CHEC and so forth, but you also have individual entrepreneurs who see China's establishment of diplomatic relationship as an opportunity to have investment in places like the Pacific Islands. Of course, the Pacific Islands is relatively small compared to, Southeast Asia or Africa or other places, and therefore the value of investment and also, the kind of investment is quite different from those places as well. But it is important nevertheless. And so Henry Schwarziska, I keep mispronouncing his name. He wrote a paper in which he talked about the reverse engineering of the BRI. That a lot of times we think of the BRI as very well organized in China moving forward, but a lot of times if you dig into it a little bit more, you will notice that it is much more messy than we sometimes assume. And he was looking specifically at the case of Fiji and how companies would come in, establish themselves, and then find ways in which they can access credit back in China, and therefore see if they can be connected to the Belt and Road Initiative, or at least be framed as a Belt and Road Initiative project. And therefore, the relationship between the Chinese state and Chinese companies, different kinds of Chinese companies, is also very complicated as well. Of course, most of the infrastructure development that we are seeing in the Pacific Islands is by Chinese SOEs, but there are also other Chinese companies involved. And then there are the Chinese from within the Pacific Islands. And they are important in understanding China in the Pacific Islands. The Chinese associations in places like Fiji, and the differences between them. There is an association for the new Chinese, and there is an association for the old Chinese. And so the competition and the discussions that take place between them, and their access to elites in places like Fiji, and their competition for access is also important to understand, because that influences the way in which China engages with the Pacific. In the case of Solomon Islands, an important group is what is known as the Solomon Islands Chinese Business Council. And it is a group of Chinese from Solomon Islands, mostly Solomon Islands citizens, who are able to benefit from subcontracts from the big infrastructure developments. And therefore, for them, it is important to have that relationship. It is important to have the infrastructure developments because they benefit from it. They also have very close relationship with the government as well, or at least they know who to talk to, they know how things work within Solomon Islands. And I am certain that you have that in other Pacific Island places as well. In terms of the CDF that you mentioned, April, so this is not a Chinese thing. This is something that existed since the 1980s. And then it was funded by Taiwan, actually. Taiwan used to put in about $8 million. The Chinese have moved it up to about $11 to $12 million. But I think what is important to also understand is that the foreign contribution to the CDF is only a percentage of the total value of CDF. Most of it is actually Solomon Islands government contribution. And therefore, the Chinese part of it has a lot of visibility because of the discussions that we have. But it's actually the Solomon Islands government funding it. Yes, there are lots of controversies around the CDF. We have an election in April next year, so it's going to be a big issue in the Solomons in the coming elections. But I think it's important to understand that it is not just the Chinese. It started with the Taiwanese. And the Taiwanese, when they were contributing to the CDF, they had a lot of criticisms as well. The Chinese came in and said, yeah, we'll take it on. And they have been criticized as well. But even in Solomon Islands, a lot of people, I think, don't realize that a lot of the contributions are actually from Solomon Islands. And so I just want to end here by saying that the Chinese presence in the Pacific is dynamic, changing, and it's important to be able to identify the changes, and it's also very, very complex as well, and it is not monolithic. The China's presence is complicated and comes in different forms. I'll stop here and then we'll have Q&A.
Great. Well, I think those were two excellent presentations from Dr. Herlevi and Dr. Kabutaulaka. A lot of nuance, a lot of complementarity between the comments, I think, and just calling on us to think about what exactly we mean when we say China, and also, all of the variety we get across different actors once we start to disaggregate. So we have a number of questions coming in from the online audience, and I'll open up the floor to in-person attendees in a moment. But I wanted to start out with one question that I'm guessing is in the minds of many folks, which is, where does the U.S. sort of fit into this conversation? So we've been focusing on Chinese engagement with the Pacific Islands, which is a huge topic. But obviously the U.S. has also been paying a lot of attention to this region of the world, particularly since some of the announcements that you mentioned. So, how can we think about the U.S. in terms of its own relationship with the Pacific Islands, and in this newer conversation, how does it fit into these dynamics? So perhaps we could start with.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think what I'll say first is, I wrote this in the original study we did on Micronesia, and that's what I already said kind of at the outset. Like, I still believe that there is a risk for the United States of over-promising and under-delivering. If you look at the Pacific Partnership Strategy, there's at least, I think we put it in a spreadsheet at one point, 25 different programs. Some of them are programs that already exist that were just sort of re-advertised. Some are new. But in terms of those, there hasn't been that much project. There's been a lot of announcements. I think when you look sub-regionally, I think the U.S. has obviously made a lot of progress in Micronesia. We made a comment in the original Micronesia report. This is before any of the Compact of Free Association negotiations were complete, and that was obviously a concern. That we sort of in that report said this is a sense of urgency for the U.S. This needs to be done. Now, all three have finally been negotiated. I won't get into the debates about how quickly Congress will fund and deal with that side of it, but that's a lot of progress. And I think in terms of what the U.S. is trying to accomplish, that's really important, and they've made great strides, but that's all very narrowly focused on what's the achievements that have been made in Micronesia. I still think when it comes to all these programs, I think the U.S. needs to think about what the long-term engagement strategy looks like. And this was even before most recent events in the Middle East. If we were talking a lot about how there was concern in our dialogue in the spring that the Ukraine-Russia war was going to pull away resources and attention for the United States, and now you've got conflict again in the Middle East, that's pretty typical of what the U.S. is trying to balance its global interests. But I think when it comes to a place like the Pacific Islands, I don't think you have to do a ton. Like, I think my personal opinion is that if you put together a program, like focus on implementation, and I say this after spending a decade in the federal government, implementation is a lot harder than people give credit for. It's fun to announce a new program, have a press conference. Everyone loves to do that, but the hard work is when you have to sit down and do that. And sometimes I would like to see maybe a little less media rollout and a little bit more, let's get down to brass tacks of what needs to be done.
I have two comments on this. And the first is the way in which the U.S. frames its relationship with the Pacific Islands. And I often hear U.S. leaders talk about their relationship with the Pacific Islands as beginning with the Second World War. And I cringe. because the Second World War, I think, is not a really good way to frame U.S.-Pacific Islands relations. And the U.S. often projects that narrative as a narrative of liberation. We came in, we liberated the Pacific, therefore we are friends. But the Second World War also provided the U.S. an opportunity to strengthen its colonization of the Pacific, and therefore able to use the Pacific Islands for military purposes, including testing nuclear weapons. And that's something that Pacific Islanders do not easily forget about. And I think if the US were to use the Second World War as a way of framing its relationship, it has to be careful about how it utilizes it. And on top of that, coming from Solomon Islands, the Second World War is a war that has not stopped killing. Our people continue to die because of unexploded ordinances that the US and Japan left behind. And so the Second World War is not really a good way of framing relationships. We need to find another way. My second point is the types of engagement that the US does. And I'm beginning to see this in some of the US assistance to Pacific Islands. But by and large, I think it is both not possible as well as not wise to try and compete with China in the kind of projects that they are engaged in. And they're engaged mostly in high visibility projects, like the big stadium in the Solomons, or Faleolo Airport in Samoa, or the road from Nadi to Suva in Fiji, or other big projects that are really, or the most terrible one is the convention center in Vanuatu, which is now has a lot of problems with it. And I don't think that's where the US wants to put its money. But to look at strategically assisting Pacific Islands to approach sustainable development and with communities that have an impact on the ground. And one good example, I think, is the scale project in the Solomons that the US is putting money into. And that's a good way. It doesn't have the visibility, though. It doesn't have the media discussions about it. But I think in the longer term, it's going to have more impact on the livelihoods of people.
So are there questions from the in-person audience? Anyone? Please.
So hot takes on yesterday, 3 Pacific Islands say their leaders will skip the annual block meeting of the Pacific Islands Forum, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands. Do you have any commentary or thoughts on that? The 3 Pacific Islands say their leaders will skip the Pacific Island Forums meeting, Papua New Guinea, Vanuatu, and Solomon Islands. Do you have any comments on that? Or?
Let's take a couple of questions first, and then please.
Great. Can I get in 2 quick
Sure,
questions?
go for it.
one for each of you. For Tarcisius, as someone who's written so much about the ethnic troubles and the conflicts in the Solomons, including what happened in Chinatown, I'm just interested, what do you think personally about the idea of having potentially Chinese security of some kind operating within your country? And for April, the Australians get very exercised about the Chinese presence in the Solomon Islands because it's strategic for Australia. But sometimes I hear assertions that the Solomon Islands is strategic for China or it's strategic for the US. And I'm just interested in your own thoughts as to whether that's the case or not.
I don't have any comments about potential countries I haven't looked into that issue and was not familiar, so I will leave that to my co-panelists. I will go to the issue about what is strategic. I think there's sort of 2 dimensions to that. I mean, do I personally think the Solomon Islands is strategic for the United States? Probably not. I mean, it's just, but I think the region as a whole, I do like the US to remember that there is a history here and a past, both good and bad. And to Tara's point about the sort of World War II framing, I agree with him. We hear this regularly in dialogues, does the US not realize that World War II is not great memories because colonization continued after that was over? So I think there's work to be done from the US perspective. And I do think there's a history. I think the challenge is actually the closeness right now of the US-Australia partnership. As they have gotten closer, I think there's, and I don't want to say asking the US to, but it's like they want one another by each other's side, and that can be good and bad. I mean, I obviously there are countries in this region that have a very unique relationship with Australia. And in some cases, the US might want to forge its own path in terms of its foreign policy and not just rely on Australia, which during the period of, quote, like benign neglect, that's more or less what the US did. It just sort of deferred to what Australia was doing, which didn't always work out the best. They did have more expertise, but I think we're past that point. So I think there is a need to look at the region as a whole. It's not necessarily individual countries, but I also think it's, if you listen to Pacific Island perspective, it's about climate change and sustainable development. So I think to reinforce that point, that is probably where the focus of US attention and policy needs to be.
Very quickly, and then we'll go. To your question, this is the first time I heard about this, so I'm not sure. I haven't heard this, so yeah. But I know there's a delegation from the Solomons going to the Cooks, because I see them posting pictures.
Okay.
The Cook Islands.
Wish you were here.
Yeah. But to your question, Ben, I think, it's important to note, and perhaps, I need to look at this a little bit more, is that geopolitical competition have both regional as well as domestic impacts. And those impacts can be negative sometimes because they cause divisions. So in terms of the China-US competition, and Australia part of it, is that it has regional impact. So you see divisions, or you will probably see divisions at the regional level as well. And this affects the unity of Pacific Islands regionalism. Although we know that Pacific Island countries do not always agree on everything. They sometimes have divisions, but geopolitical competition can have a lot of impact on that. In terms of domestic, so the opinion of governments are often not necessarily the same as the opinion of every people in the country. And so within the Solomon Islands, what you will see is that there is a huge division among Solomon Islanders. Those who support China and the current government, and those who are opposed to China. And they're very devout in their opposition to each other. That has the potential of causing conflict within the country. And I think that's why, big powers like the US and China have to be cognizant of how their actions have an impact on local domestic politics. Foreign policy and foreign relations do not always feature in Solomon Islands politics. And I'm sure in other countries as well. But I think next year, when we have the April election, that the China issue will be an issue that people will talk about. Whether it's the influencing factor, I don't know. But it will definitely be an issue in the Solomons. Not sure if that answers your question, but I think, it can create domestic conflict.
So we have a few questions online that I'll group together. One of them picks up kind of directly on that topic of domestic impacts. One audience member asks, does China attempt to influence the Pacific Islands politically in ways that may undermine democracy? Speaking of domestic politics. A second question is about why China is so concerned with the issue of telecommunications in the Pacific Islands and what the significance is there. And then the third question I'd put in is about the impact of the environment. So China has, focused heavily on economic development and economic strength, often at the cost of the environment. So how does that approach fit with the Pacific Island countries who place high value on sustainability and resilience? So maybe we could take those as a group and.
You want to go?
Sure. I'll start in the order of the questions. In terms of undermining sort of domestic political issues, there is the issue of corruption, and I don't like to make too many blanket statements because corruption, I think, looks different in a lot of places. But internal to China, there is facets of that I think a Westerner would look at and say corruption. Internally, people would say that's just how you get business done. That's how the job gets done. I think there's that debate. I think there's plenty of companies and businesses that just recognize that's the cost of doing business. I think when those firms, whether they're private companies or state-owned enterprises, go abroad, that happens. So I do think there are risks there. It is really incumbent on host nations to figure out how to deal with that. Ironically, internal to China, Corruption, though, anti-corruption has become associated with Xi Jinping sort of getting rid of his political rivals. Now, was there legitimate corruption? Yes, in some of those cases there was, but there's plenty of corruption that has gone unattacked in China as well. So in terms of democracies, it's really the host nation is going to have to figure out how that works in their own domestic context. In terms of telecommunications, I mean, from a Chinese perspective, that's just one of the digital Silk Road is the future one to make money. I mean, they have plenty of companies that have done this and have upgraded the entire network within China. So they have a lot of companies that know how to do this, whether it's laying cables, putting together, and it's both private companies like Huawei and it's state-owned enterprises, China Unicom, China Mobile, these are very active companies. And so that's where the money is, quite frankly. But I do think there's a dynamic specific to the Solomon Islands is that's what they're asking for. I mean, so as a business person, if someone wants your product and you can sell more of it, you're going to pursue that relationship. And so that is why I think that has proceeded so quickly. To the previous point too, but not all of that was previously funded by Chinese loans. Some of them are now, but I think there's still a lot of private investment because it is, I mean, the digital Silk Road is the decade-long future for China. So they're going to continue, companies are going to continue to put resources into that. And to just the final question about the environment, this is a major concern in China. There's a lot of work on green technology and a lot of solar panels and things like that are produced in China. But in terms of their own environmental record, it's a problem they've grappled with. And I think that's a huge concern. And again, it goes to the host nations, though, to how do you deal with that? How do you make them do better? There was projects, when it comes to land, I've looked at land use a lot in China, and that's one of the things I think needs to be dealt with in any other host nation, especially the Pacific Islands, if you have different rules. I mean, the way land use works in China is if you are a local government or a company, you're going to get free reign, and it's going to have some pretty negative environmental impacts. That's starting to change, but I think, again, this is where host nations have to be very clear about, are you doing the proper environmental impact assessments and other things? And that's not easy to do because people don't want projects to take 10 years or things like that. So there is a tension there that I think will need to be addressed over the next decade.
Okay, if I may very quickly, and on the issue of democracy, and I want to speak a little bit about the security agreement with the Solomons, because I think that's something that a lot of people are concerned about. And I'll be very frank, and probably my frankness also reveals my naivety. But I don't think China is going to build a military base, not in the near future. And the reason, there are a number of reasons. One is that, and it comes to the issue of land. Those of you who know Solomon Islands, 90% of land in Solomon Islands is customary owned. The Australians have been struggling to build that patrol boat station in the Solomon Islands for years, and they haven't been able to do it because of land issues. So good luck to China for finding land to build that. But I think there is a more important issue, is that a lot of what China can do is not so much in the establishment of a military base, but the accessibility of the law enforcement in the Solomons. So they can do that through working with the police without having to have a physical military base in Solomon Islands. And so my concern is not so much the construction of a military base, but the development of a policing culture in the country that might not necessarily be appropriate to the Solomons and might not work very well within the country. I think that is the security issue. That is the issue that Solomon Islands should be concerned about. And then, of course, there is the issue of capturing elites and therefore connected to things like corruption. And this is not to say that the Chinese are the only ones doing this. Everybody is doing it. Or at least not everybody, but a lot of people are doing it. But they have more visibility and they have more capital that is disposable within the country at the moment to be able to have a lot more influence. And when I talk about Chinese businesses having connections to political elites as well as other elites in the country, I think in the longer term, it's going to have a corrosive impact on the institutions of the country. On issues of environment, I think it is also important to note that the Chinese are not the only bad environmental practitioners in the region. I mean, let's look at Bougainville, that wasn't the Chinese. Let's look at Porgera, that's not the Chinese. You look around the Pacific Islands, that others have had a history of behaving really badly when it comes to environment in the region. But that does not excuse Chinese companies to therefore come in and do things the way they want. And it comes down to what April mentioned earlier on, is that the biggest challenge for Pacific Island countries is not China and the US, because China and the US will do China and US things. But it is about Pacific Island government's ability to manage these relationships, which is sometimes difficult, given the size of governments that some of these places have. It's often very difficult to be able to manage bigger powers like the US and China.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the room? Yes, please.
Well, I wanted to go back to April's very important comment about the implementation of programs. And I recently was at the Melanesian Arts and Culture Festival, and a big part of that was trying to reclaim custom, KASTOM, and the Melanesian Spearhead Group's role in urging people to reclaim their traditional ways of doing things. And the feeling, and I know we were with some people from the East-West Center too, and their feeling so strongly is that to formulate policies, make contacts, do programs, you must understand the culture of a country. And it's not just the art and the music, though that's a big part of it because that's how it's passed down, but it's also land rights and climate change, which they describe the harmony with the land and the water. And they feel that is the single biggest problem in the Pacific now. And that's coming from Ralph Regenbaugh, who's the Minister of Culture, of Climate Change in Vanuatu. And just to go on one more kind of fun thing, Tarcisius, the convention center now is in full swing. And at least they had the sensitivity to do the pig's tusk, and the design of it. But as opposed to the last time when I was there, when nobody would pay the electric bill, it is now.
It's administered by a Chinese company. They're the ones managing the convention center.
They made them do it. The Vanuatu is not paying. I don't think they're paying bills for it, but they've manipulated. They've done very well because it was a good facility for this festival. But the understanding where these people come from and their values and their practices is so important, and it's not well known in the Pacific.
Other questions or comments from the room? We have a large number of questions online. I'm going to try to group these together maybe into one last round. And so a lot of them have to do with the US. So I think that we can kind of take these together. So one is, if the US should not frame its Pacific Islands strategy in terms of World War II, what should it do instead? So just kind of a follow-up question to that. Is the US consistent framing of its partnership with the Pacific Islands in terms of great power competition with China hurting its efforts in the region? Or, what do you think the effect is in terms of framing its activities in the Pacific Islands? And then there's a question also about what the US is doing with partners such as Australia and what the reception of any health assistance given by the US, China, or others during the COVID-19 pandemic might have been in the Pacific Islands. So a lot of different questions about what is the US doing with partners and what should the US be doing differently. We have about 6 or 7 questions along those themes.
Sure. To the question or the comment in the room about sort of implementation, the first thing I say is learn. When I was asked all these questions well over a decade ago about Micronesia, I knew my own ignorance, so I went and just started reading. And at the time, I was lucky. I knew some folks at the Government Accountability Office, GAO, which was did a lot of reports on the Compact of Free Association Agreement. So I went and talked to those people. What do I need to read? I still laugh because it was quite some time ago, but several scholars said, read Epeli Hauofa. And I said, oh, okay, I don't know what that, and I have now read all his books. And when I sometimes give a lot of talks actually within the US government. And I laugh because just a couple months ago, I gave a talk where I brought not all of his, but several of his books with me. Tales of the Tekongs, I like to bring to people because sometimes I think fiction has a way to tell stories that nonfiction does not. So read about these cultures. I mean, it's what I do. And when I talk to others, I bring that stuff along. I may be that's how I know about China too. When you're a scholar of a place, you read as much as you can to try to
Phil.
yeah, there's a lot. I think there's a lot more resources out now. When I started looking at this, it was hard to find things with the amount of resources available now. But I do think understanding that cultural context is vital. And I think some of that has been forgot in Washington. I bring that up because, I feel like here in Hawaii, we've got such great resources here at the university and elsewhere that there's an awareness and an understanding. But when I go back to DC, the ignorance that exists, some of that still exists. I get asked questions that I've actually had people say to me like, oh, well, I don't know what to do. Like that country of Guam. I'm like, do realize that's a territory of the U.S. and there's a history with that too, both good and bad. And so a lot of it is just getting smart. So that'll take some time. In terms of U.S. strategy and the sort of these terms, technically, if you ask the Biden administration, great power competition is not what's going on. They refer to it as strategic competition. I'm not sure what the difference really is between those. I never liked the term great power competition, but I'm not sure strategic competition is any better. But I think it is when you learn about the region and that history, there is a longstanding relationship, and there's plenty of areas that are not World War II focused that you could talk about that narrative. I think it's kind of sad that that's the narrative people go. I say this a lot. I talk to people in the military a lot, and the reason that comes up from a military audience is because many of these battles were sort of profound, whether it's for the Marine Corps or the Navy, and so that it's a very positive imagery, and that's great for military history. What I try to tell those individuals is you have to understand the other side, and I think, quite frankly, we can go a little bit more recent. There was some periods where the U.S. was not taking a lot of action on climate change, but that has changed under the current administration. And I hope that can be a source for the future of collaboration and engagement, even though we all know that's a very hard thing. The only thing I can really say about Australia is that, and the relationship with the U.S. is that's getting a lot closer. But again, for how that relates to the Pacific Islands, that can be good and bad. And I think the US and Australia need to navigate that. I can't speak to the question about health cooperation because that's not an issue I've looked at in depth. And I'll pause there.
Great.
Very quickly, I think you've mentioned a lot of these things. I think the knowledge part of it is not only understanding the Pacific, but the Pacific Islands' responsibility to understand the people they're dealing with. Therefore, there is a need for deeper knowledge about both the US and China. And that is really, really vital. Because when it comes down to people's frustration with the US promising but not delivering, a lot of it, or not, some of it comes from a place of ignorance about the processes in the US. And that in the US, all these things has to go through a process and in Congress and with the domestic politics that's very difficult to deal with. And that's very different from Beijing. Beijing can say, we will build a stadium, and they come and do it because of the way in which things are organized in Beijing. And so Pacific Islanders also have a responsibility to understand these great powers so that they can engage with them. Australia, I think we quite understand Australia because it's close by and we deal with them a lot. And a lot of us go to school there. But the Chinese have done a wonderful job in trying to make people understand China in the way they want. And that is through education diplomacy. And so the Chinese are taking Pacific Islanders to go to school in China in the way that the US is not doing. So here at UH, we have the US South Pacific Scholarship, which at the moment, about 3 Pacific Island students from the entire South Pacific come under the US South Pacific Scholarship. I heard they're going to increase it. So 3 for the entire Pacific Islands. China takes 20 to 30 from each country a year. And then on top of that, on top of the bilateral scholarships that they have, they offer scholarship through the forum. So a multilateral scholarship through the Pacific Islands Forum. And I think in 20 years' time, or maybe even less, when the US sits at the table with Pacific Islanders, the people you're talking to on the other side will probably be trained in China.
Well, we're just about out of time for today, so please join me in thanking our two speakers for a really great discussion. Many of the questions, there's still many questions online, so apologies to the audience if we didn't quite work those in. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our next upcoming events. We actually have 2 events coming up on Thursday this week. At 2 p.m., we'll be celebrating the achievements of our Indo-Pacific Internship Award recipients to learn about their experiences, and then we'll also be taking questions about the 2024 application process. So this program basically provides $4,000 stipends to support Mānoa undergrad and grad students to do relevant internships in the region located in Hawaii. And then also on Thursday at 4:30 p.m., we'll have a talk by Dr. Anthony Medrano from Yale and US College, who'll be speaking on Fish Pay No Attention to Political Boundaries, Tilapia and Travel in the Making of Today's Indo-Pacific. And that will be in 319 Moore Hall, and that's in person only. So you can check out our website for more details. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.